Good evening, folks. Well, I say good evening because you might be joining us from somewhere else in the world where it's good morning or good afternoon. But hello, welcome to the session, the event, this live broadcast. I'm very, very excited about the conversation we'll have this evening. This important conversation, very timely conversation with two heroes. Frankly, neither of them will probably thank me for saying that because of their humility, but they are. And without further ado, because you've come to hear from them, not me, I'm going to introduce you to the first of my guests in this conversation this evening, which is Mr. Derek Gow, a farmer turned rewilder who is on a mission to save Britain's much loved but dangerously threatened native species, from the water vole to the beaver, the wildcat to the white stork, and the tree frog to the glowworm. And he is doing incredible things in all those regards. Derek, good evening. How are you?
Good evening. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Very well, sir. Very well. If you would be kind enough, perhaps, to introduce yourself to folks so that they get a sense of who you are and what you do beyond what I've just said.
Okay, well, out there in the darkness is a farm that, if you could see it, extends to about 300 acres. This week we're about to buy another 400 acres, and what we're doing is we're rewilding the whole farm. So we're returning the farm to nature. There are still some farm animals there. In fact, tomorrow there'll be a lorry coming down from Carlisle to bring us some white Galloways and some white-bred Shorthorns, which are old cultural breeds of cattle. But the animals that are left here now are in incredibly low numbers, and their job is a different one. They're not particularly here to produce beef, and they certainly won't produce milk. But what they will produce through their clean blood and dung and through their different grazing patterns, alongside a range of other creatures that are already here, like Iron Age pigs and conic horses and Exmoor ponies, is that they will produce an environment out there that is good for other life. We're going to watch the fields grow trees. We're going to be, through the course of this winter, planting and seeding very many wildflowers. And the whole genesis of what we're doing is that we realize we're not going to save the world, but we're about to create an example of how you take a land long abused and restore it in full heart for nature.
Wow, Derek. I mean, thank you for explaining that. And what, as I said at the beginning, what incredible work. And this evening's conversation is all about For the Love of Life. It's called For the Love of Life. And what you're talking about is something that rings true with me. I've heard the same conversations in Africa, the same conversations in terms of native species trampling the land and doing what the native species do. And as a result, the ecosystems are intact and healthy. So it's fascinating to hear you talk about that, Derek. Thank you so much. My other guest this evening, a good friend of mine who a lot of you will have perhaps seen me have the conversation with a couple of years ago on Food for Thought Live on this very platform. And that is my dear friend, Philip Limbury, Global CEO of Compassionate World Farming and the author of Farmageddon, Dead Zone, and the recently released 60 Harvests Left. Good evening, Philip.
Hi, Dan. Great being with you again. Thanks so much for having me along.
Oh, it's always a pleasure and an honor, sir. And if I could ask you to do the same as Derek just did, perhaps just give a brief intro to yourself so that people know who you are, if they don't already, and then we'll crack on with the conversation.
Well, the first thing to say is it's a wonderful opportunity being here, sharing the virtual stage with you, Dan, and with Derek, who is bringing back a stellar cast of wildlife through rewilding. And I certainly see rewilding as a big part of the future. In fact, I would sum up the future for ending factory farming and creating a viable, sustainable food future for all of us as 3 R's. And there's real urgency and hope for these 3 R's. The first is to move to regenerative farming, to move away from the industrial agriculture, the factory farming, keeping animals in cages, crates and confinement, which is not only the biggest issue of animal cruelty on the planet, but is also a major driver of wildlife declines and integral to the climate emergency that we're all facing. So moving to regenerative agriculture, where animals are brought back on the land in far fewer numbers overall, but given the freedom to move around the land, restoring the health of the soil and bringing back biodiversity is really so important. The second R, as I see it, is rethinking protein. So this is eating more plants, less but better meat and dairy. In fact, actually moving towards new types of meat. For example, cultured meat from stem cells would be a great idea. And the third is rewilding. Not least of the soil. And we do that by bringing back farmed animals. And in that, we can literally bring back an elephant's weight of biodiversity to every football pitch patch, sized patch of farmland, rewilding, bringing back millions of worms and other life, so that there is actually more life below the soil than there is farmed animals above it. That to me is not only a compassionate future, but an exciting one for all life, for the love of life.
Philip, I always find it so inspired listening to you, and just wonderful. And Derek, just to be able to share this platform this evening and have a conversation with two people who are at the helm of this initiative, the urgent initiative that we find ourselves in the midst of now, thanks to good folks like you. You both talked about rewilding, and I suppose I want to say, just before we get really into the conversation, folks, please feel free to engage. You have the ability this evening to ask questions of these two very knowledgeable people who are spearheading the initiatives that we're talking about. Chuck your questions into the comments, and we will share them, and they will answer your questions. And you guys both talked about rewilding, and I suppose that's a lot of what this is going to be talking about today. And I want to say, before we get into the conversation as well, that we're three people who agree entirely with the concept and principle of, we're not going to share doom and gloom, or if we do, we're certainly not going to leave you without hope, and we're not going to leave you without things you can do, calls to action, ways you can take part, ways you can make a change, ways you can make a difference. So with that, rewilding, let's start there and talk about the parallels between what you both are so closely and firmly involved with, which is the rewilding efforts. Either of you who can just give us a sense of, you both kind of just did with your introductions, but give us a sense of the basics of rewilding.
Derek, this is your territory. I would say self-willed landscapes. Over to you.
So it's a combination of different things. I mean, if you look at large landscapes or larger landscapes than this, I mean, we're 300 acres. We're a tenth of the size of Knepp. It's the most amazing project. For those of you who have read Isabella Tree's book, Wilding, and followed the journey of herself and her husband Charlie on their farm in Sussex, you'll realise that the step back they made from intensive agricultural production of corn and dairy cattle, to create a landscape that is just overflowing with all sorts of life, much of which, like the golden orioles that were there last year, is entirely unpredictable, has been the most marvelous example of how, through using processes, using the right animals. So of course there are no aurochsen left, which are the wild cattle that were once here. There are no moose left. There are a few scattered wild boar which have escaped from farms, but they're not a common animal in the wider landscape. And if you look at the Knepp Cattle project, what they've demonstrated is that by putting these animals back, that little animals are dependent on, so dung beetles are dependent on the dung of cattle that are pesticide-free, flies like all sorts of horse flies and flies that are reliant on blood are likewise dependent on the same. Annual plants are dependent on wild boar, and in winter, if you have a coarse time, things like robins and a whole myriad of small birds follow these animals as they go steadily through an environment, not only feeding on the invertebrates that they unearth, but also using the uneven ground structures they create as excellent safe bathing areas. And what they've demonstrated is that functionality of having big animals in environments that are changing has worked extremely well when you remove intensive agriculture, and indeed in the case of Knepp, they have a large enough area to still produce a very significant tonnage of very clean meat. But in addition to that, what I also say about rewilding is that it's a very broad church. I've worked for a long time on the reintroduction of species. So this year, for example, we bred our 30,000th water vole and released it into the environments of Trentham Water Gardens. And when it comes to it, we have created landscapes that are now so sterile and removed from life that all the big beasts have gone, all the small creatures, and including that, things like wildcats and pine martens have gone. Though in the main we wish to exterminate those for a variety of different purposes, to protect game or for their fur or for whatever reason in the past, we're now in a position where increasingly for animals that are kind of these cherished icons of children's books or Toad of Toad Hall or whatever else, is that these little things like squirrel nutkin and the water vole and grey partridge, creatures that we really don't want to see pass in time, because we have so created, for a very broad variety of reasons, the environments that are so hostile that any prospect of their survival, they're now dipping away very rapidly as well. So in the case of the water vole, it's lost 97% of its British range over the course of the last 100 years. And as Phil will no doubt discuss, the chemicalization of the countryside, has created a situation whereby the life in the soil is now gone. So we're looking at a landscape where not much remains. So reintroduction alongside restoration through natural processes of habitats and species is all part of this broad rewilding church for me.
It's so interesting listening to you talk about that, Derek. It reminds me, Philip, of a part of the conversation we had 2 years ago. And Derek's point there about the land being so sterile these days, taking everything away from it. And I remember you and I had a conversation about hedgerows and the importance of just hedgerows and the fact that so many of them are going. It reminded me of that when Derek was speaking of it.
Yeah, well, Derek was talking about the chemicalization of the countryside, and what's been happening for decades now is we've been moving down this route towards industrialization of the countryside, towards factory farming. And factory farming has two halves to it. The first is the removal of animals from the land, farmed animals from the land. So the cattle are taken out of pastures and chickens out of woodland edges, and they're put indoors and they're fed grain instead of grass. So in other words, we now set up a competition for food. So where before the animals were eating things we couldn't eat and converting in things which we could, so grass into meat, milk, and what have you. Now, so many animals are eating grain and wasting a lot in the conversion. Now, the second part of that factory farmed equation is where that grain is grown, because keeping animals indoors in cages looks like a space-saving idea, but actually isn't, because then you have to use vast acreages of arable land elsewhere to grow their feed. And here's where the answer to your question comes in, Dan. What happens is, as the fields get bigger, because that's the tendency with industrialization, everything gets bigger. As the fields get bigger, so the trees, the bushes and the hedges disappear. And then the chemicals come in, the pesticides and the artificial fertilizers. And so the weeds and the insects and thereby the seeds that are needed by the birds, the bats, the bees, and everything else in the food chain disappears too, leaving you with the crop. And then we feed that crop to the farmed animals, who then waste most of the food value in both calories and protein in conversion to factory farmed meat, milk and eggs. And if you want me to put a figure on it, the reason why we have food scarcity in the world, a big part of the reason is because we waste in that equation enough food, enough human edible grains to feed 4 billion people on the planet. In other words, half of humanity alive today.
A shocking statistic. And it's an interesting and disturbing reality when so much of the time, as a vegan, as most people know I am, a lot of the time people come up with a very, very baseless argument about, well, you know, how could you possibly feed everyone with plants? There wouldn't be enough space to grow the plants to feed everybody. But as you've just rightly pointed out, we're already providing more than enough for all the animals that we're consuming, and therein lies the problem. But guys, I've written this into the chat, and I'm going to reiterate it. I see questions coming in already, and I will direct them to the gentleman momentarily. Keep them coming. I think this is really, really fascinating opportunity to pick the brains of these thought leaders right here. We've got some statements of fact as well, which I think is worth sharing. And Ariana makes the great point about soil erosion. Again, conversation that Philip and I have had many times in the 60 Harvests Left covers directly. And Derek, obviously, you're so directly involved in this. And a lot of what you're talking about with rewilding is exactly that, isn't it? It's the nature, the difference between soil and dirt, essentially.
It's the rebuildings of the soil. It's having animals there that have healthy, clean dung. It's having a grazing regime that allows the grass to grow tall and to fall over and be trampled in turn by the animals. It's allowing them to graze through an environment of that's partially wooded as well. Because of course, when we look at these things like the dairy cows we pass and they're black and white in the pastures we drive through, cattle are woodland animals. If you give them half a chance, these things will be in forests, reaching up to browse leaves and in doing so again trampling the leaf litter into the soil. In the right numbers, these creatures don't do harm, and they do quite the opposite of that. What they do is they help restore soils that are depleted, where you create the circumstances that are right.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a question that's come in which I think really speaks to that, and I'm really interested to get both of your take on this. I think this is a fascinating question. Let me just find it right here. Here we go. Because this must be one of the biggest challenges. This must be. And Ariana, thank you for this question. I think it's very, very pertinent. And Philip, perhaps you could give us your take on this first. It's a question that I'm sure is on most people's minds.
How do we change current farming practices? Well, I think we have to recognize that current farming practices have been born out of decades of government policy and subsidy that has encouraged farmers to go down this harmful route. It's not farmers' fault. It's the way that they've been encouraged, subsidized, taught. And so what we need is to put that system into a different direction. We need government to get behind the new regenerative farming way. We need subsidies to be allocated to environmentally friendly, animal friendly farming. And indeed, the environmental land management scheme that has been proposed is seeking to do exactly that. Not in big enough terms, but at least it's a start. So I do think that policymakers need to get involved at government level. Companies too. It's interesting to see that King Charles III is behind the Sustainable Markets Initiative, which is a coalition of the willing with big brand names joining on and calling for an acceleration of regenerative farming. But the other thing that we can all do is make sure that we do our bit to raise these issues. And that's where joining campaign organizations like Compassion in World Farming, where we can give people on a regular basis updates of how you can get involved to bring these issues to the attention of policymakers, put pressure where it's needed on governments, on companies, on the UN, on finance.
It's huge, isn't it? Like when I hear you gentlemen talking about the realities of the issue, it is huge. It's a huge task you're undertaking. But the change is happening, isn't it? I mean, I'm seeing it happen. There's things happening rapidly and in a positive direction. Am I right in thinking that?
Can I say one thing about farming? I mean, I've been involved with farming most of my life. I started my career in agriculture. As I constantly keep on telling people, My great-grandfather was the first person ever to sell a blackface ram in Lanark Market for £1,000 at the turn of the century, and that was an awful lot of money for a sheep at that time. But when I was little, a good day out with son of Uncle John was going to stand in a smelly sheep shed with a lot of smelly other old men debating the size and the breadth of and the correction of the pattern on the head of a blackface ram. And you know, I have to say, I was brought up by farming zealots. I mean, those guys lived and breathed it, and anything that lived, in their opinion, that might impact in a negative fashion with regard to a sheep or a calf or anything they reared, it was vermin, and they killed it, and that was it. And changing, you have to realize that there are a lot of good farmers, and they care very deeply about their animals. In fact, it was brought home to me not that long ago when we did a field trip to Germany with a number of local farmers. And we went to see an intensive dairy unit where the cows never got out. Now, I've kept cattle for years. At one point in time, we had hundreds of cattle, and I would never want to have these animals inside. At the end of a day in the summer, you took great pleasure from watching the calves running races in the fields, and they could go and stand in ponds and browse and have a life that was of some quality. But what I will say is that when we went to see those dairy cattle in that farm that was modern with the shutters that came up and down, and so they're standing in the sun on sunny days. They're these supermodel type cattle that, regardless of their ills, were cozy and warm and the wind blew from the wrong direction. We wandered in there and those cows wanted to play with us. And what that shows you quite graphically is the farmer was still investing a huge amount of time in caring for his animals. Wrong system. There are people who are very, very capable of showing immense compassion and who have immense love, I don't doubt, for their animals. But Philip's right. It's the system that's wrong. The system has created a guild of people who feel entitled. They feel righteous. They think what they are doing is unquestionable. They're there to produce food, they'll tell you, and that's the mantra. But when you actually look at the iniquities of producing all this grain to feed animals that don't eat it, and in addition to that, using a huge amount of perfectly productive land to feed pheasants and grow flowers, the whole thing, with every semblance of understanding you apply, becomes more and more absurd. Regenerative farming is going back to the way farming was not long after the Second World War. It's husbanding animals in a landscape alongside vegetables and orchards and corn growing to make sure, again, as Philip pointed out, that everything you're producing is in synchrony with what you need to do to keep fertility in the soil in a way that's long-standing. The old farmers never thought they were going to... The idea of driving through a landscape where the soil is running off in runnels would have appalled them. The idea that could ever come to a time when you looked at the soil and you didn't value it as being your prized first asset and took great care to ensure that its fertility was sound would have been absurd. And this whole place that we've got ourselves to through the incentivification of chemical agriculture, which is pernicious, and it goes from fathers teaching sons that it's right, or the sons going to the college and being told that this is the right way to behave when they gain their stewardship of the land. It goes right the way through the whole system, root and branch now. And unfortunately, with the strong chemical agricultural lobby there is reinforcing it, still thought in the main that anything that exists out with that school of thinking is hippie and wrong. And that's going to be a huge thing that we have to address and change.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I was, Dan, Derek, I was struck by a banner from Patricia Ann Stevenson that was talking about how rare it is to see birds following the plough. And that was something which I've experienced here. I live on a farm hamlet here in West Sussex, and I see the plough going backwards and forwards in fields not far away. And you do not see birds following the plough. And you know what? I followed it up. I got a bird's eye view one day because I watched the plough going across a footpath, which meant that I could actually stand there and look at the soil as it's being turned over. And do you know what I saw? Nothing. Not a single worm or a beetle or other bug trying to get back into his burrow. There was nothing there. And this field was yet again growing maize, growing corn, chemically doused, and most and this is a common animal feed, of course. So it shows that industrialization that confines animals to lives of utter deprivation also causes huge harm to our countryside, and that is why there are very credible calculations, because that's what they are, calculations which show that if we carry on treating the soil like dirt, then we've got just decades left, 40, 50, 60 years left before the world's soils are useless. When they're gone, that's it. No food, game over.
Yeah. And of course, that's trumpeted, and even in the farming press, they're perfectly well aware of it. You look at the popular Clarkson's Farm, and they're discussing it there as well. And people seem to think it's some sort of joke, and there's absolutely nothing funny about this whatsoever. And on top of this, as you say, when it comes to, I mean, I've worked, as I say, with water voles and with in-species reintroduction for many years, and what you find time and time again, when you go out to, I mean, I was on one river in the South Hams of Devon the other day, is that there's just no space. I mean, there's the tiniest of vestigial areas, a few 100 yards here, a little bit more there. But, you're going up and down through corridors of land that's really ransacked, for the want of a better description, right to the edge. And where it's not ransacked, you have trees, and under the trees are the cattle and the sheep and the deer in significant numbers, because no native predators have been allowed to survive that will deal with them. And it's in some ways, I mean, I noticed that, when it comes to the comments at the bottom, there are people from all over the world looking at this. And I think one of the things that Britain, because it's a small island, we've farmed very hard here for a very long time, and we've been the dominant species, from a period that probably exceeded the Bronze Age, is that we are a good example of endgame. You either look at your landscapes and accept that you have so much control that this is the way it's going to be, or in this new regenesis that could come with elms and could come with a lot of the independent thinking that's beginning to develop now about what farming should look like and be here, you look at something that we begin to work very hard to restore in a way that's genuine. But that is absolutely also going to mean that it's not all a farming paradigm, that we can't farm our way out of this, that some of this land that's never been farmable without the subsidies which give people an economic income for doing very little with it and producing virtually next to nothing, that has to be given back to nature.
Totally agree.
One of the things that I find really, I guess, hard to get my head around, and I know you guys are the right people to ask. And I have seen a documentary called Kiss the Ground, narrated by Woody Harrelson, and it deals with this very topic of essentially how do we turn dirt back into soil, or how do you stop soil, arable soil, becoming dirt? And it's achievable, and it almost feels like it's not, and it is achievable. Could one of you explain, to in layman's terms, how that's doable?
It's doable by bringing back farmed animals to the land as part of mixed farm rotations. So what you do, by bringing those animals back, they help to fertilize the soil naturally, and those farmed animals coupled with complex rotations, so moving around the farm followed by different crops, using cover crops in the winter, so keeping the soil covered up so it's not exposed to the wind and the rain and therefore blown away, and also avoiding using the plow, so either no-till or low-till. This is the way to boost soil health. And the reason why I'm so inspired to listen and to talk to Derek is because of the wonderful cast of stellar creatures that he's bringing back. One of the creatures that I would like to be brought back to Britain, across the world, is the elephant. How about that? Rewilding the elephant. But as Derek knows, what I'm not talking about here is actually big 5-ton animals with a long trunk and floppy ears. What I'm talking about is the elephant's weight of biodiversity that should be under every football pitch sized patch of healthy soil. And the way to do that is bring back animals and treat them well and let them be part of that rotation.
Yeah. But the other key part of that is those animals have to be clean. And what we have is we have a complete chemical and drug culture based around the propagation of cattle and sheep. So if you look at, fox hunting, very interesting topic. In theory, it's banned. In practice, in these backwaters where communities are still supportive of it, you see much going on that shouldn't be. But that aside, we need to change our attitude with regard to animals. Things like foxes are a little predator. When we were running thousands of sheep here, fine, we would maybe have, it was very annoying, and when you're very tired, you'd be turning out ewes and lambs into fields, and you'd come back the following day and you'd have lost, I don't know, 5 or 6 twin lambs, and you look at it and think, I could have done without that. But the foxes in the end, when you rationalize it, actually are a nothing. They're a visible foe because they're there, this wee red scurrying entity. But the biggest foe that these farm animals face under the high octane systems of production we apply to animals in fields as well are the clostridial diseases. If you don't treat blackleg and stuck and all these different things and with vaccines, then they will take 25% of your crop. But they'll take 25% of your crop because you're trying to keep way too many animals in environments which can't sustain them. The only reason you can attempt to do what you're doing at the moment is that, and time's running out for this as well, because the nematodes, the parasites, are developing a resistance to virtually all the common drugs we have now. We've been able to do this again for 50 years because we had always got another drug coming along that would take out the next generation of parasites when the need arose. But it's, if you don't have animals that are at stocking densities that enable them to be clean, that ensure there are no clixins or ivermectins or whatever else in their dung, those animals, once treated with these pernicious chemicals in the same way as we apply them to fields of corn or vegetables, do tremendous damage. I mean, it was really brought home to me a few years ago when we were up looking at a beaver project for Lord Lowther on his magnificent rewilding estate in the Scottish borders, where 92,000 acres of land are going back to nature. And as he withdrew the sheep from one of the tenant farms, we went round to look for decent beaver habitats, and we found a few dead sheep lying in these big wide acres, as you do. They couldn't even decompose. The blowfly couldn't touch them. And these things were just dissolving like ice cream into the ground. So, I mean, it's not fair I mean, it's fair to actually describe them as toxic waste. So unless you can eliminate that kind of way of thinking about how you deal with animals, the animals themselves won't sort it. You've got to have clean animals. And if you're going to have clean animals, you almost, again, need to start thinking about the old cultural breeds that industrial agriculture swept aside because they weren't productive enough. They didn't have enough lambs or they couldn't grow fast enough to meet a target of a 30-day kill regime when you had BSE or whatever else it was. But these animals at low densities are very well adapted to Britain. And we've got to start thinking about how we deal with that as well.
It's such
Totally.
all great points from both of you guys. Thank you so much for this. And again, thank you to everyone watching and engaging. There's so many questions coming in. I want to apologize in advance because I already know I will not get to all of them. I can't possibly, but there's so many comments, and I recommend reading them wherever you're watching this, Facebook or YouTube. You'll be able to see the comments, and I'm looking at it. There's a split between the two, but most on Facebook. And we have a question that I think really talks to what you guys have both just discussed, coming in from perhaps the best profile name in the conversation, which is Dune Buggy Laurel. And from a sup, and thank you for this, Dune Buggy or Laurel, I assume it is. And I'm going to supplement this with a comment that Dune Buggy Laurel has made subsequent to this, which is, you guys, what you're talking about, Is it mainstream? Is it alternative? Is it somewhere between the two? And in that regard, is what you're talking about even remotely touched upon in schools today? And what Doon Buggy Laurel is referring to there is agricultural school. Is this something that's even being discussed there, that's being taught?
Well, I know that for
faces, I think I know the answer.
I know that for decades, the mantra has always been the chemical, the industrial way, and that's how we've come to be locked in. I don't know. Derek may have a better handle on how that is starting to change, but I do think that we do need to make sure that these messages are mainstreaming. I think one of the key things for us to understand, to realize, is that change is coming. We can't have a regime keeping farmed animals in utter cruelty that is also helping to drive the climate emergency, is a major driver of wildlife declines, and is the reason why 3/4 of our antibiotics are being used. 73% of all antibiotics worldwide fed to farmed animals to ward off disease. That is why we're heading towards a post-antibiotic era. So we have this perfect storm. We've already talked about the soils disappearing. Perfect storm. What that tells us is that change is going to come, and it's going to come soon. So the thing for us is, when the wind of change it gathers pace, and it is gathering pace, we need to be there to put up the biggest sail to catch that wind and get the change going in the right direction. And that's why I think it's so important to hear from people like Derek, to show in practical terms what change is going to look like and is looking like. Brilliant.
Well, I can I answer this question in two parts? So the first part is just to take on from what Philip said. I think there's a lot of hope, because a lot of the good stuff that's been written now has been read by people who are very bright, and you're seeing the old order changing. So if you look at the fuss there was a month ago about, and it was quite clearly a war in nature, there's no other way to describe it. There are plenty of people running around from apologist organisations saying that the Conservative government had no intention to just go back to basic farm payments, which is a system under which farmers get your money for doing bugger all. That's absolutely what they wanted to do. They wanted to do it because Liz Truss wanted to win the farming vote back, whatever that means. But the farming vote is like about 140, 150,000 people in Britain. There are 67 million of us on this island. Why on earth should those 140,000 dictate to the rest of us, especially when it's our taxes that pay their subsidy, what the landscape should be like and what wild animals should live there, and whether there should be tardigrades in the soil or not? It's utterly absurd. So when it comes to it, but when it came to that fight, I thought it was absolutely fascinating that you had organisations like the Nature Friendly Farming Network, led by the excellent Martin Lines, and the CLA, which used to not be a liberal thinking body of people, going along with the RSPB and everybody else to say, no, we've got to stick with elms. We must look to the future. Soil protection, recovery of nature is a top priority. We must not ditch this financial award. And I think one of the chilling things that's happened just last week, Helena Horton, a friend of mine from The Guardian, who's an excellent environmental journalist, has just brought it to my attention that at a recent meeting with the NFU and the Minister, that the environmental journalists are being banned. They're not allowed to attend, and they're not allowed to report on what's being said. And I strongly suspect that's because that organisation is trying to basically get the bulk of the cash that's coming for the simplest programmes there are, and those will involve nothing more than, once again, us giving our money to the farmers for doing nothing much. I think that's shocking. But to come back to what you were asking earlier on about teaching, well, what you're looking at is a deeply cynical system. I can tell you that there are probably, if there are any courses being run at the major agricultural colleges that I explain to you, either social responsibility that comes from I don't know, hammering your land hard with sheep and letting all the floodwater run down as a result into villages to spill sewage through classrooms and people's houses, or the impact of the chemicals, or anything else. It will be the most superficial of lectures, and there will be nothing substantial behind it. When it comes to teaching organic farming, you're looking at that being out with a college curriculum. So no, I don't think they're behaving at all well. I don't think they're preparing for a future. I strongly suspect they're still very influenced in their thinking when it comes to the curriculum by the wants and needs of the big businesses that are selling you the pesticides when you come out. And I think, frankly, it's probably very likely to be a mess.
Your timing, Derek, was perfect on that last point you made, because I just shared Nick's comment, which is exactly what you were saying. And I guess it kind of segues into another point you touched upon there was government, which are, of course, also sponsored by big ag and big business. But there's a question that I wanted to share, which I think is also equally important, from Caroline. Intensive systems are being given permission at the level of the county council. They're following rules and regulations detached from the wider environment. I think that is a very, very pertinent point. Can this issue be raised, please? We're raising it right now, Caroline. It's a great point. We've talked about schools. How about government? How do we do this? How do we take it to the level of being able to, are there petitions we can sign? Are there MPs we can write to? How do we go about, because I know the people on this broadcast they're not just listening for entertainment's sake, they want to take action. How do we do that?
Essentially by joining up to organizations like Compassionate World Farming. There are plenty of campaigning organizations out there. What we do, if you drop your email into our website, we will keep you up to date with how you can take action. And let me give one example of an action that we've been taking across Europe. It was a European citizens initiative to end the cage age. This was an initiative to get more than 1 million signatures within 12 months to petition the European Commission to end the use of all cages for animals farmed for food. We got that million. In fact, we got 1.4 million. And you know what? The European Commissioner herself, Stella Kyriakides, announced in June last year that the European Commission will bring forward legislation to ban all cages for animals farmed for food. What that does is puts a big heap of pressure on the UK to follow suit post-Brexit. So there are things that we can all do. We can also support other fantastic heroes. Chris Packham's Walk for Wildlife, which will be going on in London on the 26th of November. I know I'll be there. And we can all take action 3 times a day on our plate. We have the power of our decision making to eat more plants, less and better meat, making sure that any meat or milk that we do have comes from non-factory farmed sources, such as pasture-fed, free-range or organic.
Yeah, you're quite right. And I mean, I was in Bavaria about 2 weeks ago, and my colleagues who work for Bund Naturschutz, which is kind of the Bavarian equivalent of the Wildlife Trust, you recall the report that came out from Germany of the 85% decline in insects, and they now think that's not an 85% decline overall. That the 85% decline that they've identified and monitored is actually what's left of the 85% that have already declined. So the decline in insects is simply horrific. I mean, that's your pollinators gone, it's your food supply for all manner of other life gone. It's beyond belief. And in response to that report, there were marches of millions of people to say this could not go on. And it must be, I suppose, 2.5 years on. And the Farmers Union, again, went right back to government and said, well, you know, actually, it'll all pass and it'll be fine. And government said, no, it won't. It won't pass. They're absolutely right. And you guys are going to have to do what you're told to do. And you go back 2.5 years on, and right the way through the arable flatlands of the Danube, there are a whole range of different projects and programs which are paid for with public money to recreate the buffer strips along many of the small water courses where there is a significant where silt and fertilizer and pesticides all runs out into the main river Danube, to the point now where the Danube cannot be used. You cannot detoxify the water of the Danube to the point where it could be used for human use. And the water supply in Bavaria is all drawn from Jura water under the rock because there's no possibility of using stuff on the surface. So don't think that the water runoff is a minor thing. It's not. It's a very significant thing. But right away through this landscape, there are pollen crops left, right, and centre, and those are all being paid for by taxpayers to try and reverse the decline in insects. So you making a fuss really does count with the politicians, and don't think it doesn't. They don't like getting letters in numbers about different things. They don't like campaigns that show them in a difficult light. And if you do this, you start to gently ratchet round the lobbying power of the organisations that are always whispering in their ear how you don't want to see these things happen. You can change things.
It's true. It really is true, and we see it, and we've seen it. I've seen it personally from both of you, you know, thank you for spearheading those campaigns over the years, because it really, I understand, as an advocate for animal welfare and conservation myself, I understand how it can feel futile. It can feel. Philip and I, just before we went live, were talking about there's sometimes insurmountable feeling of the issues that we face, but we can and absolutely will make a difference. And there's various ways to do that, as the gentlemen have just described, in terms of, you know, making your voices heard, talking and demanding from government, from MPs, from county councils. I mentioned Kiss the Ground is one of many documentaries. It's really important to educate yourself. In fact, there's a great comment from Nick in terms of educating yourself in regards to regenerative agricultural principles. It is important. And Philip said it earlier on, we each, if nothing else, we each have an ability to make a positive difference 3 times a day whenever we sit down to eat, or 5 times a day if you're me. Yeah. And I think it's really important to do all of that, to really go out of your way to educate yourself. And one of the ways obviously to do that, as well as documentaries, is books. And I know that both of you gentlemen are too humble to say it, but I got one of them here, as I showed you in my intro. And I'm going to share another book cover, which I have a photograph of, which I'd love for you to talk about a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, Derek, as I clumsily share my screen. This is proof of the fact, folks, as you mostly already know, men can't multitask. So I'm going to ask you, Derek, to talk a little bit about your book, and I'm going to get a screenshot.
Unfortunately, in preparation for this, I have Philip's book that I've been reading, which is actually really good fun. Well done, you. I'm enjoying it immensely, but I haven't got to the end. So Bringing Back the Beaver was about the journey that's been involved in returning this animal, which is next to us and the elephant, the third most impactful species on the planet. Beavers are nature's water gardeners. What they do is they by impounding water, by felling trees, they create wetlands that can be vast, they're open, they're sunny, they have an 80% greater density of amphibians, of insects, of a whole myriad of different life forms. And the Birds, Beasts and Bedlam is a follow-up to that. And what to say about it? I mean, it's been the most incredible journey. I met amazing people. We have made some progress, but the price of progress is eternal vigilance. The idea that you ever cross a hilltop on this journey and there are the yawning pastures of success and it's all going to be easy from there on in is nonsense. What you find is the dynamic changes and you have a different kind of problem to counter. So, for example, when it came to beavers, we didn't have any beavers. We had to bring them in from Poland and from Germany and from Norway in the beginning. And then you had to create a persuasive political and practical space to have the animals restored. But, you know, to give you an example of just how vigilant you have to be, the Scottish Government last year, because there were embarrassing figures with regard to the numbers of beavers being shot in Scotland. And bear in mind, they're being shot at the behest of the Scottish Natural Farmers Union, who don't want these animals building wetland environments because they want all the land. We've always wanted everything. And the everything we've got now does nothing other than plague us. So if you look at the flood situations that we're facing now, villages, towns, settlements underwater, that's because we've drained the wetlands, we've taken the soaks and the sponges out, we've compacted the land. So when we've cut down all the forests, or they should mantle all the hills and uplands, so that when it rains hard, the water comes belting straight down into the canalised ditches, hits the first thing that offers any obstruction, and that's the settlements. And we're never going to get away from this paradigm of misery until we change the landscape that surrounds us. Beavers help because the wetlands they create can hold huge volumes of water. They can slow the flow of water very significantly. We know the science of everything, but in Scotland, where the farmers have lobbied government very effectually with to say that they can't have beavers in the croplands, this is unreasonable. Despite the croplands being the most polluted environment there is on the Tay, they had ministers consenting to them being slaughtered. So even though people said we don't want this to happen, and every year the cull went up and up and up, until last year the Environment Minister said that, well, we're not going to do this anymore, we're going to translocate them. And in the year that's followed, do you want to hazard a guess as to how many applications there have been to translocate beavers to other sites in Scotland? And at this point in time, how many proposals are likely to run? Well, I could tell you there have been 2 applications to move these animals, and there's possibly 1 application that might get a successful license. And in the interim, what that means is the wee guys that are signing the death sentences are still busy at their work. And what they don't want you to know is that it's a disgraceful situation. It's entirely down to the quiet lobbying of organisations deeply malicious and care not about nature at all. And that's how bad things happen if you don't shine a light on them. And this is a beaver.
Yes, I thought it would be a good opportunity to get a wee bit of beaver action on there. I think this is just a wonderful video.
Well, so they're perfectly capable of pulling these down, severing bits, and then of course they ping back up. And if you then walk through a woodland where they're feeding, you'll be looking at a branch that's pinged up maybe 6, 7, 8 feet. And in the past, people are looking and thinking, well, that's a large animal. In reality, of course, all it's doing is pulling it down. But they're enchanting creatures. I mean, I worked with them, as I say, for 20 years, and by and large, very, very, very steady, sedentary animals as far as behavior and inclinations concerned. Sometimes you get some that are thoroughly miserable and fairly aggressive, and sometimes you get some that are so friendly, for a wild animal that you barely believe it possible. And if you sit in with them when you have them in holding pens for whatever project, some of them will come up and play with you. They'll burble to you and they'll squeak and they'll jump towards you like a dog, moving their tail. And if you just pat the ground next to them, they'll bounce away gurgling with delight. They're charming, charming creatures.
How amazing to have had the experience with them that you have. I've never seen one, and I really, really must see one. And I can't wait to see the fruits of your labour in terms of rewilding with, well, in all regards, but where the beaver is concerned in particular. As a photographer, that'll be incredible. Thank you for talking that through, Derek. Philip, I mean, we've talked about your book recently. I did on a broadcast very recently, and I'd love for you to just, if you wouldn't mind, I have a 2-minute video to play. I can either play that and then you can talk about it, or you can talk about it and then I can play the video. What would you prefer? Oh, you're muted. You're muted. There you go. I've got you. No, I haven't.
There we go. Yeah, I'm happy to just say that, look, the book is a book about urgency. It's about hope. It's about the coming age of change and how that change really is around those 3 R's of moving to regenerative farming, rethinking protein, and rewilding, not least the soil, by bringing farmed animals back to the land, giving them a decent life and allowing them to assure that we all have a decent life today and into the future.
Well, thank you for that, Philip. And what I want to do if I may, once again demonstrating my inability to multitask, I'm going to just I'm going to play a little video. It's a 2-minute long video, folks, which I'd love for you to see. I think it's wonderful. And just let me fire that up, and we'll get it up and running for you. Bear with me, because there's an important thing I missed there. There's a little button that you have to click which says include system audio, and if I don't do that, you just see it, you don't hear it. And I teach this stuff, but I didn't share system audio, but now I'm sharing it, and we're going to hear it as well as see it. So let's get this show on the road. Bear with me. Kaboom. Wow, I find that such a moving piece, Philip, and the book that it talks about is equally moving and important. And this is one of those challenges for a guy in my position who looks at the time in the corner and thinks I could go for another 3 hours with you guys, and I really want to, and I know that a lot of the folks watching want to as well, but I also know that we have to draw a line under it somewhere, otherwise people outside of this live broadcast just won't watch it. And we're at 57 minutes, believe it or not. It feels like we've been about 7 to me. But I wonder if you gentlemen would like to share any closing thoughts before we end the broadcast this evening. You both said, like, no one wants to go first. So I'm going to invite.
What I'll say is, I mean, we've been working away on rewilding the farm here, which is a small area, as I say. We know that a whole range of species have gone. We have reintroduced some species like water voles and harvest mice. Next year, we'll reintroduce glowworms. There are beavers. They're now living through all the water courses on the farm. We have reinstalled the rock piles, the crevices that once would have been here for the crevice dwellers, and were probably removed from the landscape in the Middle Ages, so that in the not too dim and distant future, there will be adders, common lizards in the pastures. We have put in over 40 ponds to date, and we're digging more at the moment, so that when you pass through these become environments rather than fields. And the cattle that are here live in these environments. But as you pass through the fields where the ponds are, there are duck and snipe rising as well. And the small birds and the insects, you're already beginning to see a change in what can live in an environment that was at one point in time fairly hostile. But it's slow and it's going to take time. But it's quite clearly the case that if you make an effort and rethink what you're doing, we have plenty of examples of that worldwide, some in Britain, many in continental Europe, then we can relearn how to live with nature and start to create this better future for us all.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights, Derek. Philip, over to you, sir.
Well, it's such an inspiration to hear of the work that you're doing, Derek. And the next cut of that film, I want to have beavers in there and all sorts of other creatures that you're bringing back to the countryside. And what I would say is look, 60 harvests left. That's not a prediction, it's a calculation. And we've got to change that trajectory. Change is coming. And we, by all joining hands, becoming the movement that we can be, can put up that big sail, catch as much of the wind of change as we can, and drive change in the right direction for a compassionate future without factory farming, that brings back wildlife, that brings decent food for everyone as a basic human right, and creates a better, sustainable future for us all. We can do it. Let's go to it.
I get moved deeply by listening to you both speak, because this is real, guys. This is real. This is now. This is what's so moving to me about it, so poignant about the conversation we've just had, and the insights that you both share and the hope you give. I want to point you both to the comments. I've been sharing a few of them as we go, but people are really given hope by what you both do. You're leading the way for us. You're shining a light for the rest of us to follow. And I know knowing you both as I do, your humility will be somewhat uncomfortable with that, but you guys are heroes to us. And I want to thank you for sharing your insights and your thoughts and your leadership in this endeavor, because it couldn't be more important, folks. It really couldn't. As it said in the film, and as the gentlemen have both said so eloquently tonight, it's our future we're talking about. It's the future of animals, nature, the planet, the whole lot. So if I could urge you to do anything, it would be to, well, I'll show you. It would be to follow, don't worry about me, but follow them. Follow them on Twitter, Compassionate World Farming, Derek, Philip, both of them. You'll see their Twitter handles there. Please, I'll just leave that floating along on the bottom there. Grab the books. Stay tuned. Jump on. You'll find in the comments that even though when you see the things that I share on screen, you can't click it. In the comments, you can. So you'll find if you go back into the comments, you'll see the links to Compassionate World Farming, the email list, ways you can get involved. In fact, I'll show you what else you'll see. You'll see a link to that, keepitwild.org.uk, which is Derek. Please follow these gentlemen's lead, because they are lighting the way for us all. That leaves me only to say a huge thank you to you both. A huge thank you for giving us your time, your insights, your understanding, your expertise, and the knowledge and the hope, most of all, the hope that you give us. And thank you for all that you do and for sharing an hour of your time with us. I don't want to end it, but I have to, folks. It's my favorite task.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
and stick around, because when I end the live broadcast, we'll still be able to talk, but we'll be gone from the live broadcast. So, folks, thank you for joining us. We will be back with more. I feel sure of that, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you so much.